Hello, welcome to the Online Ethics Center's Spring 2022 webinar series, Bringing Ethics into the Conversation. I am Caitlin Wiley. I'm an assistant professor in science, technology, and society at the University of Virginia, where I teach engineering ethics and data ethics. The Online Ethics Center is hosted at the University of Virginia, and we are a digital repository for resources on teaching and learning about ethics, specifically in engineering and science. The OEC also fosters a community of faculty, students, researchers, and other professionals who come together to discuss ethics. So please check out our website at onlineethics.org. The theme of our spring webinar series is sustainability and environmental justice. The series is sponsored by the program in Science, Technology, and Society at the University of Virginia, and I'm delighted to host our two speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Glen Miller, who is an instructional associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Texas A&M. He has an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering from Missouri University of Science and Technology and a master's and doctorate in philosophy from the University of North Texas. He is an associate editor for the journal Science and Engineering Ethics, and his research focuses on philosophy of engineering, philosophy and technology, and environmental philosophy. He regularly teaches courses on engineering ethics and cyber ethics. Dr. Miller is going to speak first, and then we'll hear from Dr. Jennifer Richter, who is an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State. She's also a senior sustainability scientist with the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. Dr. Miller and Dr. Richter will then have a discussion about their talks, and we'll finish with questions from you. To ask a question, please type in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll read it to Dr. Miller and Dr. Richter. So thank you for being here. Dr. Miller, please take us away.
Thank you, Dr. Wiley. It is a pleasure to be here for a number of reasons. One is I've always been impressed by the work that the Online Ethics Center has done, and so to be able to contribute to their mission is something that gives me considerable joy. I think they're doing really important work. Two, you may have noticed from my from the biography that Dr. Wiley read that I didn't follow the normal track to philosophy. My undergraduate degree is in chemical engineering, and part of my interest in these kinds of problems was in the 1990s when I was working on my undergraduate degree. Engineering was all about solving technical problems, sometimes without considering the broader impacts. And after about 10 years in the business world, asking enough questions about these kinds of problems, I ultimately ended up realizing they were all philosophical. Had the chance to go back and study at UNT, which at the time was the University of North Texas, which at the time was the best place to study environmental philosophy and still has a lot of great things happening there. So thank you for having me. And I'm particularly happy to be working with Dr. Richter on this panel as well. The seminar series, the seminar for today is teaching sustainability and environmental ethics, and so I want to spend most of the time talking about the concepts, but I want to start by framing this just by reminding people what the goals of ethics education are. Some of the goals we want to keep in mind: moral awareness, moral imagining, skill of moral reasoning, having a commitment to following one's moral goals, and then also knowledge of professional ethics obligations. And I think these are all something that sustainability and environmental justice topics help engineers gain. That is, maybe the most important here is moral awareness. If you've never thought about environmental justice or sustainability, your engineering work will be much different than if you have, even if you're not the one who's ultimately making final decisions or setting policy goals, especially as a new engineer. So maybe have those ideas: moral awareness, moral imagination, or moral reasoning, commitment, and professional obligations in the back of your head as we talk through, as I talk through environmental sustainability and environmental justice. The first question to ask is, what do we mean by sustainability. And this is a term that's nebulous. In a paper called Exploring Engineering and Sustainability, I argued that we really haven't defined it quite well enough. I also argued that engineers have a very important role to play in figuring out what sustainability means, especially in this century. One of the early definitions is from the Club of Rome in a report called Limits to Growth. Here they define it as an equilibrium, a global equilibrium found in spite of accelerating industrialization and population growth that leads to depletion of non-renewable resources, widespread malnutrition, and a deteriorating environment. And if we can find that global equilibrium, what we will be able to do is to stave off societal and industrial collapse. The worst case scenarios so far of the limits described in Limits to Growth haven't come to be, although the problems that we have with climate change certainly suggest that an element of their analysis that we haven't quite fully taken into account. It's also worth noting that this definition of sustainability, which comes from the policy space, is very focused on human welfare, human well-being. A second answer, 1B, to the question of what is sustainability comes from the Brundtland report. And the report they wrote is called Our Common Future. And their definition of sustainable development, which serves as a rough proxy for sustainability, is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs in areas of population, food security, the loss of species and genetic resources, energy, industry, and human settlements. So there's certainly more that's taken into account here. There's more concern about the population of the environment, that is what the species are, what the genetic resources are, but it's still described almost entirely in an anthropocentric or human-oriented focus. Even the concern about species and genetic resources isn't at all for their own welfare. For something like intrinsic value, but it's for humans to be able to meet their own needs. A second line of definitions of sustainability comes from the environmental space, and one common one closely connected to conservation, the conservation movement, and you see the picture of Gifford Pinchot, is an sustainable action is such that does not jeopardize ecosystem services. Thinking of ecosystem services, we're talking about the provisioning of food, purification of water, and fertility of the soil, so that these ecosystems are able to maintain the same number of humans as they were previously. Here, maybe the best way to think through this definition of sustainability is to think through what the U.S. Forest Service did, which Pinchot ran at one point in his life. And that is, they want to make sure there's adequate growth of trees. They don't necessarily care that much about the ecosystems, but they want to make sure that there is enough lumber and other products for humans to use in their development. This definition of sustainability is contrasted with what comes from John Muir, who is closely connected with the national parks. And again, the distinction between the National Forest Service, National Park System is worth keeping in mind. National parks tend to try to preserve the species and the organisms that are there, as opposed to simply conserve some kind of resource. And to use language that follows from Muir's definition, we want to respect the balance of nature, which is a term that ecologists tend to not really like that much, because there's really flux in nature. And so it's a real question in figuring out what sustainability means, but the basic idea in this definition, but the basic idea is that we shouldn't disrupt too much natural ecosystem membership, that is the species and their numbers and the processes in the ecosystems. We find sustainability mentioned in the National Society of Professional Engineers Code of Ethics under professional obligation 2. The professional obligation is engineers shall at all times strive to serve the public interest. Under that, item 2 says engineers are encouraged to adhere to the principles of sustainable development in order to protect the environment for future generations. And in that item, we have the only footnote in the NSP Code of Ethics, and that is where they define sustainable development. And the way it's defined in the code is the challenge of meeting human needs for natural resources, industrial products, energy, food, transportation, shelter, and effective waste management, while conserving and protecting environmental quality and the natural resource base essential for future development. So engineers are tasked with the challenge. Perhaps if you're a philosopher, you say, well, sustainability may be many things. It may be challenging, but it may be a little bit more than just a challenge. I think this is a bit of both a challenge and an opportunity for engineers. The fact that this term is fuzzy. There are some challenges for engineers who really wish to implement sustainability. One is that there is uncertainty in the way our economies develop and the way our technical spaces develop. And so it's not immediately obvious which natural resources will ultimately be limited. The products that we use today are different than the ones we used 100 years ago or even 20 years ago. And the second question is, how long should we be thinking about when we think about sustainability? An infinite period of time, or a couple hundred years, depending on that time frame, it's not clear how much we should worry about natural resources or even about pollution that comes from specific processes, because our processes change so quickly. A second challenge that engineering has is related to the first, that there's a dynamism of innovation. We keep coming up with new and better products, systems, tools, and yet there's a stability of sustainability, to use the idea introduced from the first definition of a global equilibrium. How do you manage this moving target that comes from, or these moving forces that come with innovation, and somehow figure out how to properly align them with some kind of stable goal? Not only are there challenges, there are also opportunities. One opportunity I think engineers, especially working through their professional societies, have is to help us figure out what sustainability means practically or operationally. For philosophers, in a way, it's okay to say we have a few different definitions of sustainability. Maybe all of them help us at different points. For engineers who are trying to operationalize the term, a more clear definition or operational definition would be helpful. And I think that may also spur philosophers, policy people, and other interested intellectuals and lay people to realize the challenges that engineers have, and as they think through sustainability, have their conversation be enriched by what engineering professions have been able to contribute. A second opportunity is for engineering professions to help us figure out some of the natural resource constraints that are in place, and maybe come up with some good solutions or alternative pathways for society to take, so that our either resource or environmental situation doesn't overly limit future opportunities. Maybe there are some products that are slightly more expensive, or some resources that are slightly more expensive, that can serve as suitable substitutes for those that are very limited. That is the kind of thing that I think that engineers know in a way that many other people who are interested in this term, interested in the challenge of sustainability or in the goal of sustainability, don't know. And I think that's some way they could contribute to this discussion. And then lastly, of course, engineers love solving problems and developing practical solutions. And it seems to me pretty clear that any solution that we come up with, societal solution that we come up with, that respects the principles of sustainability will require a number of practical solutions from engineers. We can think in terms of sustainability in terms of three scales. One, there's a geographical scale. That is, are we concerned about what's happening in my local ecosystem, maybe in my larger river basin, maybe in a country, maybe in the globe? There's a question of temporality. Are we thinking short term, as I mentioned previously? Longer term, are we thinking about future generations? Are we thinking about future generations of other species as well? And then lastly, we can think about sustainability for both human and non-human communities. And usually when we think through these different challenges and the interrelated nature of our economies and socio-technical systems today, we realize that sustainability is political even more than it's ethical. That is, it is a characteristic of some kind of whole, bigger than just me or my process, even though it does come with some ethical requirements as well. Sustainability often brings people to the topic of justice. And here we can look at early definitions of justice, or maybe pre-industrial era generations of justice. I often think back to Aristotle, who says that justice requires equitable distribution among people. Sustainability requires, maybe most clearly, the equal distribution among, or equitable distribution among generations, but also about the global north and the global south, the industrialized countries and those that are still developing. Justice typically means that I can take a fair share for myself, but also that I am concerned with distribution for others. And it is, as I said, a political sense. That is, it's across the whole. We can think about our polis, which was the limit of space that Aristotle thought of. Maybe in the 1980s, 90s, our concern was nationwide, but maybe ultimately we need to think broader than that, that is to the cosmos. We see these ideas of justice, we can apply them to sustainability, and if that comes up in the Q&A, we can talk about that some as well. But there's the second topic that I've been asked to address is environmental justice. And many people may not be perfectly familiar with the term. Environmental justice is related to other forms of justice, like justice in the political processes or justice in the distribution of goods. But its emphasis is a little bit different. It can be thought of as a complement to those other forms of justice. Here's a pretty good definition. It is the development in theory and practice of an equitable distribution of environmental burdens and environmental benefits. So where normally when we talk about distributive justice, we're talking about who gets the latest laptop or maybe some kind of financial distribution. Here we're talking about environmental burdens, such as hazardous waste plants, landfills, that type of thing, and environmental benefits, such as the parks and open space, those types of environmental items that improve our quality of life. So we have, the first item is distributive. Second is fair and open processes in making related decisions to that distribution, especially that involve those affected by them. So here we have a procedural element to environmental justice. That is, the decisions shouldn't all be made in Washington, DC, or in Brussels, or in Beijing. They should be made by people who are going to be affected by the distribution of the environmental burdens and environmental benefits. And then the third element of environmental justice is to recognize that many of these processes and decisions that were made in the past that set the trajectory, the environmental, technical, industrial trajectory that we're on, excluded many groups. Here, women were often excluded. Most of these decisions were made by men, and minorities were also excluded as well. And we know that, especially in the US, as we look, if you look back through the histories and see who the important figures were, you'll see that it's not as inclusive, certainly as we would like and as it should be. Environmental justice is involved because it's interesting because the people involved come both from academics, from a range of disciplines, philosophy, legal studies, history, and the social and natural sciences. But it's also been driven to a large part by non-academics, by people concerned about their own welfare, the welfare of their communities, or the welfare of a community, who don't necessarily have advanced degrees, anything like that. Let me go through a few key figures and moments. Unfortunately, there's lots of moments that we could pick from, but I'll go through these somewhat quickly because I'm a little bit slower than I thought I'd be. The Shisho movement in Japan had to do with a chemical plant that was releasing methyl mercury into the industrial wastewater. That is a toxin that accumulates in seafood that was consumed by the local population and led to an intergenerational disease for the people that lived around that bay, around that area. And ultimately, they were almost ostracized from Japanese culture because they became sick because of what the industrial entity was doing. Many of you may be familiar with Lois Gibbs and the toxins that were found in the Love Canal. In the 1970s, she encouraged the resistance to the status quo, that is of about 900 families were living over, I think it was 21,000 tons of toxic waste in the Love Canal. And the scientists didn't really seem to care much, but the citizens were able to force some kind of change here. The California Waste Management Board pops up a couple times. In 1984, they had hired Sorrell Associates to write a report that encouraged the siting of landfills in areas that were low income, low education, and predominantly Catholic. They said, if you're looking for a site, this is what you should look for. They also pop up in the environmental justice literature because of the resistance that their people put up towards the attempt to site a plant in Kettleman City. And there, the citizens ultimately won legally, in part because the environmental impact statement was only available in English, and most of the residents in the area were only Spanish speakers. And of course, in the mid-2010s, we can talk about Flint, Michigan, which is something we talk about when I teach this in my engineering ethics course. There are a few key intellectuals I'd like to mention. Kristen Schrader-Frechette put environmental justice on the map, in a sense. I mean, she wasn't the first on this, but she wrote a 2005 book called Environmental Justice. She's a very worthwhile resource. She's a philosopher and a scientist. Robert Melchior Figueroa was a professor of mine who's been active in developing the concepts of environmental justice, as well as reaching out to indigenous communities to make sure that that they are involved or able to participate in these decisions. Kyle Powis-White has done some similar work, really doing great stuff, reaching out to different populations. And Iris Marion Young has developed some guidelines or some principles for substantive and procedural justice in her work. I'd also like to point out that the Online Ethics Center's Environmental Justice Subject Aid offers a number of other resources that many of you may find interesting. Okay, Iris Marion Young and Christian Hunhold in a paper called Justice, Democracy, and Hazardous Siting proposed that if we want to fairly or equitably site hazardous waste facilities, things like that, justice requires that citizens are involved from the beginning in determining possible sites, determining the environmental characteristics, that is, where should this kind of environmental harm be cited, what kind of political practices should be adopted as we make this determination. Citizens should also be involved in figuring out what kind of compensation different communities should gain if they're willing to take on such a burden, and what kind of safety measures are available to minimize the harms. Hunhold and Young argue that communities should retain the ability to refuse the site. That is, after all this is done, to say, no, thank you, this is not a good deal for us, this is not something we like to pursue. And ultimately, they make the claim that citizens need a more substantive voice in determining what we consider acceptable industrial practices at whatever political space we're working in. And with that, I don't know if I'm going back to Dr. Wiley or straight to Dr. Richter.
Over to me. Thank you, Dr. Miller, for this very helpful citing of concepts of sustainability and environmental justice. And Dr. Richter is going to pick us up with environmental justice. So let me introduce her. Dr. Jennifer Richter is an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society and the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State, as well as a senior sustainability scientist with the Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. Her research focuses on energy justice, specifically in relation to the cultural, political, and environmental issues that come with larger energy transitions. By examining how science and technology policies collide with local expectations and understandings of environment and politics, Dr. Richter explores the effects of energy technologies and policies on society at different scales, from the local to the global. So thank you, Dr. Richter. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And Dr. Miller, thank you for that excellent segue. My research focus for the last 15 years and probably for the rest of my life has often been in nuclear technology. So I'm going to focus and take some of the ideas from Dr. Miller's talk and apply them to nuclear waste management and the nuclear fuel cycle itself to give a little bit more of a case study to this. So I'll start here with a discussion on equity and justice in nuclear energy. as Dr. Miller pointed out, philosophy is one branch of thinking about environmental ethics. Justice is the application of that philosophy in many ways. It's a reflection through our legal system most of the time in the sense of what are the values of our society. So again, just to reiterate, he said the distribution of risks and benefits, which unfortunately is often reduced to economic terms. What is the harm that will be caused by this and what is the cost of that harm? So to get beyond just the distribution aspect of that, the recognition justice aspect looks at the historical context, the patterns of misrecognition that have occurred with any particular decision itself, the asymmetrical power relationships between decision makers in the process, and then the different perspectives of stakeholders, their values and their goals within that process as well. Then going beyond recognition, you also have to address the participatory or procedural justice aspects of any of these energy technologies is what I focus on at least. So the participation of affected parties and their rights within that process, how accessible and how transparent the process itself is. And just to give you a snapshot of what the United States looks like right now in terms of nuclear energy, this is a map that's given out by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who is in charge of licensing nuclear power plants in the United States. And you can just see from this map alone, the United States has had about 12 reactors come offline in the past 10 years. There's now 55 nuclear power plants with 93 reactors throughout the United States. And the geographical distribution is pretty obvious, right? This is definitely an energy source that benefits the eastern half of the United States. Once you get beyond the Rockies, Mississippi's okay, but once you get beyond the Rockies, it becomes very skewed in terms of how much the western United States benefits from nuclear power. I live in Tempe, Arizona, in the Phoenix metro area, and about 50 miles away in Buckeye is the nation's largest nuclear power plant, the Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station, which is really interesting considering that we don't have a lot of water around here. In nuclear power plants, the light water reactor requires a lot of water. So already you see this geographic distribution that might be considered a misdistribution of this particular power source. I'll turn here to the nuclear fuel cycle, which I also think is really instrumental for understanding some of the environmental injustices that come along with nuclear energy production. People usually focus just on that middle piece of that gray building, the light water power reactor, but there's a whole set of different steps within the nuclear fuel cycle. And I tend to focus mostly on the mining and the waste aspect. And the questions to ask in terms of justice, in each of these stages, what are the potential and existing injustices to land and communities? How do we literally articulate what the risks may be? And then how do we plan for addressing those issues in the future? What concerns remain unacknowledged, especially when we rely on technocratic decision-making, which for nuclear energy is really a legacy of Cold War practices. If you think about how nuclear energy was introduced to the United States, how nuclear power in general through weapons was introduced to the world, and then how energy was introduced to the United States, it was very much reliant on expert-driven ideas of how this technology should and could be implemented and designed in the United States. But then there's a lot of issues that are externalized within that process as well that have come back to really affect the trust in the system. So the question becomes then, how do you balance expert knowledge with local knowledge and also thinking about intergenerational concerns? Nuclear waste is a wicked problem. There is no solution for it that we have currently, even though we've been using this as a species for the last 70 years. So I'll focus here on the mining and the waste just to bring up a couple of case studies that, even though they seem divorced from the nuclear waste issue or from nuclear energy production, are actually really critical to understanding some of the legacy aspects of this. So the first one I'll turn to is environmental racism around uranium mining, especially for the Navajo Nation, which is America's largest indigenous reservation. Has about 300,000 enrolled members on that tribe and occupies a huge swath of northern Arizona and also New Mexico and into Utah as well. So the heyday of uranium mining for the United States was really a boom period in the 1950s and 1960s as both nuclear energy and nuclear weapons were being ramped up in terms of production. And that's led to a lack of trust in the regulatory institutions and the industry claims of safety that have resulted from the mismanagement of uranium mining in the US. Specifically for the Navajo, there was a lack of protection and warnings, specifically for Navajo miners. Anglo miners, they had better ventilated mines, they had protective equipment. Navajo miners were given none of that. They were not told about the risks of inhaling the radioactive particles from uranium mining. They would come home with the dust on their clothing and then have meals with their family and sleep with each other at night. And all of that just spread to the children of the Navajo as well. So a lot of systemic and structural injustices that have created systemic health issues, both intergenerational and intergenerational as well. There's also persistent environmental contamination from the legacy of abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation, many of which are still, people are still attempting to map them, like what kind of radiation is still coming out of those mines. Then to take this into the recognition justice sphere, you have to look at the longer pattern of divestment from the Navajo itself, the pattern of environmental racism and colonization that has been part of the American legacy from first contact until the present. Notably for them, the loss of economy that came from the federal government coming in and culling their sheep herds in the 1930s and 1950s left them very susceptible to any other type of economic investment. And so when uranium companies came along and said, not only can you work in these uranium mines, but you can also stay close to your families, they were very amenable to doing that without understanding what the risk would be. There's also a lack of accountability and transparency for addressing their issues. This gets you into the bureaucratic and participatory justice issues, the cost of representation itself. The United States did pass the Radiation Exposure and Compensation Act in 1990, revised that in 2000 to make it a little more accessible. But the major places to enter your claims to redress would have been in Phoenix or Albuquerque, which are each 4 hours away from some of the major towns in the Navajo. So the cost representation, the medical expenses, the travel to get their claims create these extra burdens on a group that is already incredibly burdened by the legacy of colonization. It's worth noting that the EPA has designated, I think about $1 billion to deal with abandoned uranium mines across the Navajo, but it's slow work, and the other issue becomes where will all of those waste products go from the dust and the mining. So I'll move here into the nuclear waste portion of the nuclear energy cycle. And this is a tortured history, of course, as well in the United States. So here's a snapshot of the history of the policies from the federal government. And one thing that I find very fascinating about nuclear is that it's very much a federal issue, right? We don't do a lot of state nuclear. States don't govern or produce it themselves. It's very much between the federal government and then local communities, with the states interceding to protect themselves. So in 1982, Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, designated all federal money for geologic repositories, both interim repositories and permanent repositories. It was amended initially in that 1982 bill. The idea was that there'd be 2 sites in the United States, one in the east and one in the west. By 1987, the bill had been amended to designate one spot, Yucca Mountain in Nevada, which then became known as the Screw Nevada bill, locally amongst Congress people there and by the state itself. Within the NWPA, there was a clause that Nevada could veto the selection of their state as the site, but there's also another clause that said Congress could override their veto, which members of Congress voted to do because many states wanted to get nuclear waste out of their states and into Nevada as quickly as possible. This creates a real tension between local, like Nye County in Nevada is more amenable, but the state of Nevada has continually rejected any movement to get Yucca Mountain open, and the federal government is legally bound to get Yucca Mountain open. That is part of the NWPA. So now paying fines to states that have continued to produce nuclear energy and nuclear waste because they can't get it out of their states. In 2010, President Obama said, you know what, we got to go back to the drawing board. This is a stalemate. Nothing has happened. There's nothing going forward with this. We need to start over again. So he created the Blue Ribbon Commission for America's Nuclear Future to basically do a global tour of nuclear energy and nuclear waste sites to figure out another way to try and get something like Yucca Mountain or some sort of process to manage nuclear waste in the United States. They decided that a consent-based siting process would be the most likely to result in a socially and politically and culturally acceptable management of nuclear waste. The DOE agreed, and they started to initiate a consent-based siting process. In 2013, they started collecting public data, held a bunch of forums and roundtables to try and engage the public more on these discussions of what could a CBS process look like. I'll just say that my group at ASU, the Expert in Citizen Assessment of Science and Technology, we were contracted by DOE to hold these massive public forums, 100 people in 5 cities across the nation simultaneously, to try and understand what the public is actually thinking about nuclear waste, if they're thinking about nuclear waste at all. We were ready to initiate those forums in 2017, but due to the shift in the executive priorities due to the presidential election in 2016, the project was canceled because it wasn't considered to be a priority of the incoming administration. Certainly it was not. In 2020 now, the DOE is reinitiating the CBS discussion, and in late 2021 to 2022, just this year, they put out a request for information on trying to get the CBS process kickstarted again. And they've decided to start with interim storage, which is really fascinating because for many communities who have been dealing with this kind of conversation for the past 30, 40, 50 years, interim storage is really dangerous because if you can have a de jure interim site legally designated, but the issue is how do you prevent it from becoming a de facto permanent site without the actual repository like Yucca Mountain being open and operational. So a lot of mistrust there between states and the federal government about whether these projects can actually come to fruition in any reasonable way. So I'll finish here with a discussion of the CBS process. What does it address in relation to environmental justice concerns? So the distributive factor here for me is that instead of just of trying to use this Cold War containment discourse, the idea that all risks from any nuclear activity can be safely contained and controlled by the assiduous application of science and technology, how do we actually acknowledge the actual risk to the political process and to the democratic process itself, as well as the environmental concerns for communities that would be living adjacent or near these kinds of or invested in these kinds of projects for their community? What can they control over time? What is out of their control? How do they figure out this process and where they're supposed to be in it without that access to information? The other issue, of course, is trying to isolate nuclear waste management as if it's somehow separate from all of the other extractive industries that are affecting the Western United States. This is as the Western United States is also the highest rate of population growth. Like Arizona alone has exploded in population. We're using more water, we're using more resources. How do we then also think about putting in nuclear waste repositories while we're also trying to think about how to get helium out of the ground, for instance? So trying to link this, instead of keeping it separated, trying to link it back to what has been called the wasteland discourse. Tracy Boyles uses that great term, wastelanding the West. The West has often been used in the American imaginary as a place of storing and hiding and experimenting with these dangerous substances. How do we get beyond that and think about it as a place that's vibrant and growing in its own right? There's also the idea of the Cold War legacies and how that would affect new technologies. The United States is not building a whole bunch of light water reactors, but we are thinking about small modular reactors. How does that affect this discussion as well? In the recognition aspect, you have that similar power asymmetry between federal agencies, local communities, and the states themselves. Where do states get to exercise their power in our unique political system? Where does the federal government then exert its power on top of those states? And this has become very evident when you think about the negotiation between the world's only existing permanent geologic repository, which is actually the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico. But that is legally, one of the negotiations for that site with the state of New Mexico and the DOE was that it would only hold waste from the nuclear weapons system rather than from energy. So people don't think of that very often in terms of nuclear energy production. You also have larger public concerns than just the repository, the energy and the transportation aspect. When we were trying to plan these forums with the DOE, they specifically asked that we not allow participants to discuss energy or transportation. But when you constrain public discussion, you're already lacking credibility in the process itself. The idea is, how do we think of these things as a system rather than trying to isolate them? And then there's intergenerational concerns as well. How on earth will we explain these sites to people who may not be American, may not speak English, thinking about this 100, 200, 500 years in the future? And with the participatory aspect, which Dr. Miller already touched upon too, the creation of legally binding accountability and transparency in the decision-making process. How do you build credibility and trust between regulatory agencies and diverse publics? So one of the major issues with consent-based citing is that the public doesn't trust regulatory agencies. But another issue is that regulatory agencies don't trust the public, right? The idea that if we come from a technocratic culture, experts who are trained in how to understand environmental conditions are going to be the arbiters of these decision processes. The public just has to sit back and accept that because they don't know any better. So how do you break down that very reductive idea of the public deficit of our ability to understand these kinds of issues? There's also the public's right to engage in discussions and the federal obligation to host those discussions without constraining them. And one of the major issues that we come with consent-based citing is literally, how do you define the word consent? Who gets to define that and how, under what conditions? And that goes back to who can actually give consent to host one of these sites? And then when at this process can you actually withdraw your consent if you decide it's no longer something you want to engage in? So those are the major concerns, I think, with CBS and thinking about it as an environmental justice issue rather than as just a technocratic issue that needs to be solved using engineering and science itself. And I just stuck a little plug in there too of a really interesting project from the 1980s when the federal government DOE said, we need a way to mark these sites. The EPA says you have to mark them for 10,000 years. They asked a bunch of academics how to do that. And they come up with hilarious lines like this, right? So that things that say a lot to us in the moment when they're produced, but don't really speak to what future generations might consider as important when thinking about how to engage with their local environment. So I'll stop there and hopefully we can get into the Q&A.
Fabulous. Thank you, Dr. Richter. That's you've just raised so many issues from one
So many
particular
issues.
application. So many issues. Yeah. I would love to see this in a classroom, actually, see what students would say. So yeah, do you guys want to talk to each other for a minute and then we'll open up the Q&A? Sure.
Let me hop on Dr. Wiley's comment. When you teach this in the classroom, how do you do it and what kind of response do you get?
It's really fascinating. I think, so a lot of people don't really understand the nuclear fuel cycle in general. So there's a lot of backtracking into like, what was the Cold War? What were we fighting for? Why did we produce all this stuff? I have a whole set of slides on the legacy of Cold War activity in the American West. And there's a ton going on in the East too, but because I got many of my degrees in New Mexico, I'm very intrigued by New Mexico as a site in the atomic imaginary. So just looking at New Mexico and fanning out from there has been really interesting. But they don't know a lot of that stuff. Most Americans don't know that legacy anymore. So linking those historical patterns to these current efforts, I think they get a better understanding of why these are so controversial. And I will say that my first time teaching this at UNM was an introduction to environment science and technology class. And it was a requirement for mechanical engineering majors. So I really cut my teeth on trying to convince people who are like, you can solve this problem, to be like, this is actually a political and a cultural issue. And those can't be solved by building a hole in the ground and sticking your nuclear waste in it. Like we tried, it seemed really logical in the 1970s, but by the 1980s, that lack of trust in nuclear energy, in particular from 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, other chemical accidents like Love Canal and Bhopal, there's really very little trust in those regulatory agencies, and it's just decreased. So I think for them, their minds are kind of blown. We have a really good discussion on how you would mark a site for 10,000 years into the future. And it's a lot of just like trying to think about what our values are and how we're trying to express them, and then how they are expressed on the landscape itself.
Yeah, thank you. I know that sometimes my engineering students, I don't think it's too strong to say they're dismissive, but I think sometimes students feel almost powerless in these situations. And I think to some degree that's fair. Engineers aren't going to solve problems of sustainability and environmental justice just by doing better engineering. That's not going to happen. This is a social problem that affects all of society that requires a comprehensive solution. But I think they still have a role, and understanding some of these histories is really important to practicing good engineering, to realize that there is a history behind what you're doing, and that certain people, for example, in the Kettleman City event that I mentioned, when the courts took a look at this, they actually ruled on civil rights laws that the siting board hadn't taken into account the fact that they had a pre-existing site already there. And of course, one of the common moves is to say, okay, we've already destroyed this area. This is already a wasteland. Let's double down here. We got another worse site to put there. And they didn't take into account the air quality in the basin where Kettleman City is. And they also didn't take into account that most of the workers there were agricultural workers who are already exposed to a great deal of chemicals just in the course of pesticides, herbicides in the course of their work. And so if you take all of that into account, it seems to me the decision-making process that you have is far more complicated, but also far better than if you simply say, which site will give us the best geologic formation to try to hold this waste, and where will we get the least political resistance?
And then to flip that and say, what is the best process instead of what is the best technological system, right? What is the best process that gets us credibly to this particular site? I think your major, and this is what I love about environmental justice, it's a conversation about power, right? Who has power in our society? Who is trained and disciplined to think they have more power, that they should have more power, that they naturally should have more vote in that decision-making process? And engineers are right at that nexus. Like, they're very privileged in many ways in our society, but America is becoming very anti-intellectual, very anti-elitist. We all have to be careful in higher education about how power is being exerted on us, and then also how we are exerting our power in society as well.
One of the questions I like to ask my students is, do you have some kind of special technological expertise to address policy issues such as this? And I get a mixed response. Some of them say, yes, I do. I'm an engineer. I understand how some of the basic thermodynamics or material balances or whatever work better than the rest of the public who have never thought about this thing. But usually as the conversation goes on, students say, but my expertise is really limited. I'm a mechanical engineer specializing in the aerospace industry. What privilege do I have above someone else to say that here's what we should do for nuclear waste, for example? And then as the conversation goes on, almost always some student says, we're also self-interested in our industries and in what we do. And so we may be worse than people who aren't at least involved in industry. Now, one one of the studies that Rob Figueroa taught us about in our seminar was about too many times policymakers or engineers think that the general public isn't smart enough to understand what's going to affect them. But it turns out that you don't need to know you don't need to be a nuclear physicist to understand the likely implications and the uncertainties involved with projects like this, and that usually with something like 3 months or 4 months worth of outreach, the citizens have a really good idea of what's going on, and you can tell from the comments that they're making that are on point. They understand the risks, maybe they understand the benefits of having some of the sites that you may not want for environmental reasons or for health reasons are great from economic reasons. And so, as you mentioned, the goal is consent there, and of course, what philosophers always emphasize is informed consent. And so the question there is, what do we need to do for information? It seems to me that the work you're doing really helps along those lines.
Yeah, I do see that as the major contribution of academics. Like I don't know where higher education is in the terms of like the trust level between federal and community, but at the same time, like we study this stuff, we have this obligation to say, how can I help with the free and informed information part of this, right? Like, how do I create unbiased, accessible, freely available materials that anyone can actually access to get more about this, especially in age of misinformation, right? So what is our obligation? What is our sense of accountability across the disciplines? And the only way to do that is to get this interdisciplinary effort together. Like, I really feel like engineers and social scientists have to be in conversation with one another. One of my favorite teaching experiences, they canceled the program, unfortunately, but it's called Science Outside the Lab. And what I loved about it, I taught one for social commercialization, a master's program on social commercialization, so solar engineers, and we would actually take them to Washington, D.C. to meet with policymakers. And I called it the class that taught engineers why all their amazing ideas are never going to work. So you got to go back to the drawing board and deal with all these policymakers that are like, you're really concerned about solar energy, but I've got a whole host of other things as a congressperson to deal with in my legislative district, and energy ain't even touching it. So it's a really fast, like a humbling experience, but then they always got out of it like, this is really complicated. And I have to keep searching about this political system to figure out where the barriers and the roadblocks are for something that I believe can be really beneficial. And I'm like, that's exactly what you have to do in these situations. And also get ready for the long slog. Like, it's just a very long journey to get to some of these technological implementations that will actually help achieve things like sustainability, resilience. I often think of like the mismatch of the political values too. Like in the energy system, the idea, the goals were utilitarian, affordability, accessibility, stability. But now we have resiliency, sustainability, flexibility put on top of that, but the infrastructure is so obdurate. It's so long-standing. So how do you think, I'm going to lecture on Hoover Dam today. And I'm like, how do you think about Lake Powell and Lake Mead in the West that have basically 4 drops of water left in them as the basis for millions of people living in these arid cities? How do we engineer our way out of that one, right? And we'll need the engineers for that very badly, but we got to ask different questions about that too.
Right. Dr. Wiley, do you think we should open it up? I see some interesting questions in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. There's one that touches on what Dr. Victor is just talking about, in the sense of how do you make sure you're doing it well? How do you judge? How do you measure? How do you assess environmental justice or even sustainability? Like, how do you make sure you're focusing on the right things?
I think a lot of it has to do with communication and transparency. Like, you have to keep asking the communities, you have to have an open channel with communities to understand what their hopes, their fears really are. And I'll just think here about like the waste isolation pilot plant, which has been operational in New Mexico since 1999, accepting nuclear waste. They had a couple of accidents at the site in 2014, and the DOE has set up weekly town halls there to communicate with the public and say, what are your questions? What are your concerns? How can we keep the trust in this project with the community going? And it's the regular check-ins. It's saying, we are accountable to you. We are part of your community. We are not going to leave you just because something went wrong. We can fix this and we can go on with it. Whether or not you agree or believe, that kind of communication has led to a level of trust between local policymakers and then federal agencies too.
So it sounds like then you're calling for different metrics than utilitarianism, different methods.
Exactly, yes, because
effectiveness.
utilitarianism, it always goes back, it leaves out the pattern, right? The people who have been constantly affected. I think of the Navajo and how they've been used and exploited over the last 70 years with no understanding of why sheep and uranium and railroads all work together, and the reservation system all work together, right? So it's easy then to diminish and dismiss their claims. If you look at it from a justice angle, it's like, wow, this needs to be addressed immediately. And I think the EPA is also doing really interesting things in terms of environmental justice to recognize those claims.
Yeah, and it really resonates with what Dr. Miller was saying about the NSPE definition, that it starts with a vision of sustainability as focused on human needs.
Mm-hmm.
So like, how do we think about the needs of communities, but also the needs of the human species, but also the needs of the world and the rest of the organisms and systems in that global system? Like, how do you explain that engineers are called to focus on human needs and not the rest of the system?
I see this as an incremental improvement. Sustainability was added as a footnote. I'm pretty sure that when we go back, I tell my students this, in 10 years, it won't be a footnote anymore. It will be part of the text itself. And in 10 years, it also probably will be broader. I don't know the history of how this footnote was added. That would be very interesting intellectual history to find out. But my guess is that it was what they could get everyone to agree on. And no one seems to argue that we shouldn't preserve or conserve resources well enough that future generations will be able to do something with them. People do disagree about how much we should be worried about the different characteristics of the environment. Although I ask students in the engineering ethics class I teach, how many of you consider yourself strong anthropocentrists? That is, someone who believes that human interests and desires outweigh almost all those or all those of other species. A weak anthropocentrist, which gives some kind of preference to human desires and interests, but also recognizes and sometimes constrains human desires based on those of other organisms, or a biocentrist. And most of my students say that they're weak anthropocentrists now. And I think if you would have asked that question of engineers 25 years ago, certainly 50 years ago, they would say strong anthropocentrist, and maybe not even think twice about that. And I think that you see that in the legacy of the dams, especially in the West that you mentioned, Dr. Richter. There, I think at one period, maybe it was just 1 year, there were more dams removed than built, which is, if you told that to an engineer in the 1970s, they would say that's impossible, that's insanity.
Right.
So then how, like, while you guys were talking, I was thinking about accountability and whose job it is to make sure we're weighting these priorities appropriately, whether it's people or systems or organisms. And one of the questions asks, how do you ask students, what questions do you ask students to get them thinking about this to trigger some more ownership? How do you encourage accountability all the way down the line, right? Not just policymakers, but also engineers and community members to like actually take this on as a collective mission.
This is a great question. A great question that for every single element of engineering ethics or ethics in general, how do you end up with commitment to whatever the goal is? And I don't know if, I mean, I wish if I could figure out how to do this really well, I would get an NSF grant that would fund me for 40 years so I could figure out how to study engineers as they go into society. Moral psychologists have been working at this for a long time, and it's really, really hard. But I think we start with awareness. And in the same way that academics, by nature of our role in society, have some kind of obligation to study and organize and articulate the problems that we face, we also have the responsibility to make our students aware of it. And without awareness and without them understanding the ideas, we won't succeed. Whether we will succeed with what we do as academics in a 4-year process, well, probably not, right? There needs to be more forces at work pushing towards sustainability and environmental justice, because there are certainly powerful influences pushing against it far beyond what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I think to build on that, there's the pragmatist in me, and then there's the idealist in me. And I teach in justice studies, and I teach in the future of innovation in society. But like, one of my favorite students to have in the EJ class is somebody who's training to become a petroleum engineer. I'm like, you are exactly the person who needs to have these ideas in mind as we continue to produce oil. We will produce oil. We continue to use oil. Like, there's no part of me that rejects that that's going to just disappear in the next 5 to 10 years. But how do we train students then to be thinking more broadly about the systems with which they're engaging, rather than just the one technical discipline that they're being trained to do? Like, how do they think differently about what they're going to be doing with their lives? And then the pragmatic aspect of that is that we'll probably stop using oil as much over the next 20, 30 years. So that's their career. How are they going to think of this as just one moment in their career, not something that will be the end of their career once the shift? I'm thinking about coal transitions, right? We go from 45% coal 10 years ago to 25%. Peabody's bankrupt. Many of the major utilities are divesting from coal. How do people in the coal industry get trained? How do they find training? How do they think about what the next stage of their career is going to be if it's not going to be based on coal, rather than trying to sell a discourse of like, it's wrong for the world to move away from these fossil fuels, right? And I think that's, if they're in our classes, I think that's already a really good sign, right? These are exactly the groups of people we need to be engaging with.
Thank you for this optimism from both of you. You see this as an improvement. That's awesome. So let's finish with a question about the role of engineering in like global systems. So specifically, if we're arguing for incorporating sustainability and environmental justice into engineering ethics, how does that fit with ideas of transnational and global technologies, innovations, and also environmental harms that seem to be growing?
Mm-hmm.
That's
yeah, I guess
great.
I still remain optimistic. It's just my nature, I suppose. But I think about all of the horrible things that are happening now, especially in the nuclear issues around Ukraine. But at the same time, I think about all of the different national policies emerging across the world to say, we acknowledge climate change. It's going to, the way we've planned our societies cannot be the way that we plan for the future. And I deal with nuclear waste. So thinking about 10,000 years in the future, I'm like, the efficacy of the nation state system is actually under question here. Like, if we are all individually fighting for our own nation, how do we then think about something like climate change? So this idea of coalition building across countries, across political systems, across grassroots organizations, that's what I love about environmental justice. Like, I think about Standing Rock. Maybe they didn't get everything they wanted out of that, but the world knew about it. And all of these indigenous groups came from all over the world to stand in solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux. Like, that's a beautiful and amazing thing, to stand up together and say, we've got to do this differently. We just can't keep victimizing the same people over and over again. So I tend to look at the hopeful moments of those kinds of coalition building exercises.
Yeah, and the social and political moments. I love that. What an image.
Yeah, I too am an optimist. This is maybe part of the reason why I've liked Dr. Richter since I met her on Monday. I think we're making progress. We're talking about things that were never mentioned. We're doing research in areas where things haven't been studied before. But I think there's a huge challenge on what to do with the criticisms of how to make sense of the relationship between the global north and the developed countries and the developing countries in the south, what to do about elements of climate change, genetic diversity, preservation of different areas. The interests do not align at all. And if you look at the 1992 Rio Declaration, you see that many of the developing countries were very concerned that Western countries or Northern countries would stop them from the kind of development that they wanted to pursue. I don't think there's any easy answers here, but I am positive or optimistic in the sense that at least we're asking the questions and we're making the conversation broader.
Agreed. And you two have helped us do that today. So if you guys, I didn't get to all the questions in the chat. Sorry about that. If you want to continue the conversation, we welcome you to keep discussing on the OEC's discussion boards. And to do that, you can follow the link that Courtney's going to drop for us in the chat to sign up as an OEC member, which is free. And that gives you access to our newsletter and our discussion forums, and our online resources are available to anybody. You don't have to be a member. And please join us for our next webinar, which is on April 20th with Dr. Glen Miller from Arizona State. So finally, thank you so much to all of you, and especially to Dr. Miller and Dr. Richter, as well as to the OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, our coordinator, Courtney Walker, and the program in STS at the University of Virginia. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.